see. I think because it's summer, probably we're not going to have too many more people, but we will start. I'm sorry we're late, 15 minutes late already. Welcome to ACOMS. This is our 12th session. I think this is really exciting. It started back in 2012, and we've gotten to know people very, very well as far as they have been able to share their story with us. And we will start with introducing Sarah Wiersbeck and her son Mark Wiersbeck, that you all probably know. So these are questions that I will ask you that I also sent you by email. And the thing is, please feel free to answer all and say only what you want to say. You don't have to give personal information that you are not very comfortable sharing. So just say whatever you want to, and we'll go from there. So I will start with Sarah, if she is ready.
Okay.
All right, so first question is, where were you born and where else have you lived?
I was born in Binghamton, New York, and this was my first move away from home when we moved to Rochester, Minnesota.
Only two places then.
Yep.
You've been in the same house in Rochester the whole time?
Well, I grew up in, when I got married, then we had our own home in Vestal, New York, and from there we moved to Rochester.
So you've been in the same place in Rochester the whole time? Or have you moved to
Um, We were in an apartment, and then we bought a house, or built a house in the country, and it was Byron. They call it Byron, Minnesota. And then we downsized to a townhome in Byron. So I haven't been around the world.
How about you, Mark?
So I was born in Binghamton as well, and lived there until the age of 10. My father was with IBM, and he was originally from South Dakota. Actually, I should back up. He was the first ODAR to join the family. And so he was from the Midwest and wanted to get back out here, and took a transfer to IBM in Rochester. So at the age of 10, came out and mainly grew up in Rochester, went to college at Mankato. After I got out of school, things weren't so good, economy-wise, early 80s, that my relatives out in Boston said, why don't you come out here, things are good. And so I moved out there, took a job. I was out there for about 3 years. Kind of got homesick from Minnesota, so I came back in '87. And then I was here until '93. The company was starting to downsize. I was given a choice of being laid off or going to a center in Chicago. So I decided to go to Chicago. And I switched jobs a couple times after I got laid off down there. And then I got to the point where I wanted to get back home to Minnesota. So in around 2000, moved back here, and I've been back since. I've lived all over the Twin Cities over the years, so probably 8 or 9 different suburbs of the Twin Cities area. Yeah.
How about family, parents, both of you, parents, grandparents, brothers, sisters, cousins? Have you been around them as you were growing up, or what do you have to tell us about? What could you tell us about them?
Yes, I grew up with my mother's side, aunt and uncle, and on my father's side, aunt and uncle, and my godparents, Harry Tashton. His parents were our godparents, and we all kind of grew up together. My cousins that lived a town away, and back then you didn't have cars. So it was my father that always drove when we went to jobs. That's where we were. And out in the country, I did not have Armenian community. I just grew up with a lot of different nationalities.
So my mother grew up on a farm. My grandfather, when he came over, started the farm, and actually it's still with the family today. But I think I was born and lived on the farm until I was, about 3? And then we moved to Vestal. But what I remember about that time, I'm until the age of 10. On a lot of Sundays, we would go over to my grandmother's house and have a feast. It was, and my aunt and uncle lived next door, part of the farm itself, cousins. So there was always a lot of Armenian spoken, lots of food. I can remember my grandmother saying, eat, you're all skin and bones. And I was actually kind of a chubby kid, but they had a huge garden, and so we always had fresh fruit and vegetables. I remember picking raspberries and eating them in a bowl right away. They had those Concord grapes and the big grape leaves you make for dolma. We always had fresh food, and it was just wonderful. And my aunt, uncle, cousins is what I remember from Binghamton. Once we moved out here, we didn't have one relative in the state of Minnesota other than our immediate family. So, until we really joined this community,
Do you have brothers and sisters, Mark?
I have one sister. She's down in Texas. She had moved away, I think, in '93 or so. She got married, and her husband's with the Boy Scouts, so they had moved out east. They'd been away for 20-some years now. But yeah, they're down in Texas now.
How about you, Sarah? Any siblings?
I have a brother and a sister, and my sister and family live in Massachusetts, and my brother and his family are still on the farm, but my brother passed away a couple of years ago. Just one sister and one brother.
Okay, so where in Armenia did your ancestors come from?
They came from Karpet, Turkey. That's where they grew up.
Perfect. All right. And have you learned anything interesting or unique about that area and or about your ancestors, about Karpet? Does it count a lot in your life, or has it in the past?
I guess I could say, as far as I didn't know grandparents. I didn't have any grandparents like other kids. And that's when Mom told me that what happened to the family. My father's side of the family was wealthy, and that's how he was able to smuggle his two sons out of the country before the genocide. My mom had a brother who came to America, and so there was just my mother and her brother. But on my father's side, it was a large family, but only two of the brothers who came to America survived.
So has any of that counted in your life? And you, Mark, has it had any effect? Do you think about it, or historically?
Well, as far as my part, I learned from my parents to be kind and appreciate people. It didn't matter if they were whatever nationality, whatever religious background, or whatever race. It didn't matter. But to be kind and be respectful of other people.
I would say I was very fortunate because my grandmother lived to be 102, that I got to spend some time with her over the years. Even after we moved out here, she had come out toward the end of her life and had some time to be with her. And I think over the years I became more and more appreciative of what her and my grandfather family had gone through, and makes me feel very lucky for all the hardship that they went through to appreciate what I have in my life.
That's right. Okay, so was there an Armenian community in the area where you grew up?
There might have been in the city. I mean, yes, there was in the city, but where I grew up, I was the only Armenian girl in the class and all through school, except when I was a senior, there was another Armenian boy that graduated. And after I had graduated and I, of course, learned how to drive and we had a car, Mom thought it would be good for me and my sister to get involved in the city with the Armenian kids. And so we got involved with the AYF. And from the AYF, there was a fellow from New York City that came to our chapter and talked to us, and he said, well, we're having the AYF convention in New York City, and we would like to have you come. Well, there were several of us thought it'd be fun to go, but everybody backed out, but I did go. And then the following year, it was in Cleveland, Ohio, and I went there, and they elected me to be the secretary, so all week I took notes, and the following week on my vacation, I was typing the notes. So in 1953, you'll find me in the Hellenic, you'll find all the notes there from that particular AYF convention.
And you, Mark, you probably were too young until you were 10 years old, right? On the East Coast
Yeah.
to get involved in much? How about?
I remember going to Armenian picnics every now and then. There was one Armenian girl, and I remember her name to this day, Monique Janian, growing in grade school before we moved out here. That was the only other Armenian that I knew in New York other than relatives. Once we came out here, I don't think there was one in Rochester that I knew growing up. I can't recall any.
So when did you start getting involved with ACOM?
You know, it was after I moved back from Chicago, so the church had been established, so it would have been early 2000s when I started coming to some of the events there. I was getting the newsletter back in the 80s, and I know you folks were meeting at the houses, and I don't know, for some reason at that point I wasn't ready to be involved, and but once I did start coming, it was wonderful. I had a whole new family.
And you were also on the committee for a while.
I was social director a couple different times, yeah. That was very enjoyable. You get to know a lot of people that way.
Did you go to any of the picnics? Do you remember going to ACOM picnics?
Prior to that, yeah. Once I had started coming to some of the events, yeah, I think before I was asked to join, yeah.
Okay, so I think, Sarah, you talked about the school. Did you go to Armenian schools and
No Armenian,
no Armenian school for either one of you?
no Armenian school,
Okay.
no. We learned the language from our parents, and then when I was older and we were getting out, we went on, the group of us would go on picnics to Syracuse, Utica, Troy, New York, Springfield, Mass, and meet a lot of Armenians. But I didn't grow up with a lot of Armenian kids. I just grew up with a lot of different nationalities.
Do you speak Armenian as well as English?
I speak Armenian, but it's a while since I spoke Armenian.
It's the Western Armenian.
Yeah, right, as well as English.
Yes, I learned Armenian, and then my mom wanted us to be sure we learned English before we started kindergarten, because it was hard on my brother when he started kindergarten. He was 2 years older than me. So we tried to speak English to make it easier when you go to school.
So in your home, you grew up actually speaking Armenian as the first language then?
In our home, we spoke Armenian.
What I remember when I was quite young, before I was school age, was after my dad would go to work, Mom would talk to my grandmother, I don't know, for an hour or two every day, and it was all Armenian. And so I would hear these words over and over, and I got familiar with some of them. I never really learned to converse in the language, but hearing that, and then on the Sunday dinners, there was a lot of Armenian spoken as well. So it became very, very comfortable, very familiar to hear it, especially when they didn't want us to know what they were talking about.
Do you feel you understand some if you are around Armenian-speaking people? How much do you understand now?
Keach.
Kichon.
Yeah, very, very little. After my Habitat trip, I tried to learn the
Yeah,
language.
tell us about that.
So in 2004, Cynthia Erickson, it was the first trip I had gone Jim was on it, Francis was on it, Steve Rith, Nigerian. Most of us, I think other than Cynthia, was our first trip there.
Yeah, Michelle.
Michelle
Hayes.
Hayes, okay, yeah. So it was a wonderful group, and we were seeing it with our eyes for the first time. And I remember I have kind of a special story because my mother had given me an address of relatives there. Never spoke to them, and she told me that her cousin had corresponded by mail over the years, and then had passed on the address to my mom in the late 90s. So there had been some correspondence prior to my trip. She gave me the address. I didn't think a whole lot of it. I thought, well, if I see them, I see them. I don't know. I don't know them. And so we were in Yerevan, where we stayed, and at that time we had a van. We had our Armenian liaison for the Habitat who translated for us. We worked on 2 houses that year. I think it was 3 days each, and then we had about half the time was social to learn about Armenian. Yeah. So if you can imagine starting out in the city, and we took the van to the first house, and you're out in the country, and that time it was like going out basically into the third world. You're on dirt roads with huge potholes, and I remember the van about 5 miles an hour meandering around these huge potholes in the road in the country. And it wasn't all that long after the earthquake, there were domics that people had been living in. Some were still living in them. The house of the first family we went to had moved from that to their barn, and they were having this house built. And so we were working on the house, and I had the address, and I went to Gohar, our liaison, and I asked her, I said, this, my relatives, do you know where this is? And she looks at me, she kind of turned her head sideways, and she said, we're in that village. If you can imagine, like if you're downtown Minneapolis and you go out in the country, say drive a half hour out, any direction, and imagine you're there where distant relatives live. So I asked the family of the house we were working on, I said, do you know the Stepanian family? Well, they lived, I think, about 5 miles away, and they didn't know our relatives. But as you're working on the house during the day, other relatives are coming over to help out, aunts, uncles, grandparents. And so I asked as people would arrive, well, one of the uncles knew the family. And it was later in the day, and he said, I can go over and let them know you're here. And I said, well, we'll be back tomorrow, because we're going to be wrapping up and going back. So we came back the next morning, and we were starting to work. And I remember Cynthia saying, Mark, there's someone here to see you. Now, back up to Binghamton. My grandfather passed away when I was about 5 years old. But I just remember him. He was a sturdy, what seemed to be a very tall man. But I have this picture in my head of my grandfather. So when Cynthia said, there's someone here to see you, and I look over and I see this man, and it gives me the chills. He was the spitting image of my grandfather. And I had asked my mother prior to that, I think the night before, to give me a list of questions to make sure I have the right person. She'd given me 5 specific family questions. And so with Gohar translating, because he didn't speak any English, I asked these questions, and right down the line, everything was perfect answer. And I'm saying, okay. But then he's looking at me skeptically. He's like, I'm not sure who you are. So I said, my mother is Sarah. And all of a sudden, his eyes lit up. And it was like magic, like we knew, okay, we're related. So he said, my daughter speaks English, and I can bring her. And I said, well, tomorrow we're on one of these social days. We won't be here, but we'll be back one more day. And if you bring her then we can talk. So they did, and she came back. And so we talked, and we made arrangements for my next day off. They were going to come pick me up at my hotel. They did. They brought me out to their house. And it was pretty amazing. All the relatives were there. So this is my mother's cousin. It was him, his wife, Armenian, the daughter, her brother, his wife, and their baby all in that house. Next door was my mom's cousin's brother and his family, and then there was a third cousin that lived not too far away. So if you can imagine people coming in and out of that house the whole afternoon into the evening. And I remember they had glasses lined up for a toast. So we had a shot of vodka, a glass of wine, and then I can't remember the third glass. So I made a toast, and just kind of off the top of my head said, we have this connection with our family over all these generations. We've never met, but yet we have this close connection. And we took a shot. Well, then my mom, the other cousin, poured another shot, and I'm going, wait, we got to slow it down. But Armenian translated everything back and forth, and the other thing was, in the interim, I had asked my mom and my aunt to send pictures of our family, and they had done it by email, so I made photocopies, and so I had those when I went. I wrote all the names, and they recognized the names, so they got to see, our family. And then Armenian went over to this drawer and pulled out a bunch of pictures that had been mailed over the years. And one of the first pictures she pulled out was me dancing with my cousin at her wedding. And so that was pretty cool. But it was just a wonderful time to be together. And, on my second trip, we got together again. We've communicated occasionally since then. We did FaceTime, which was pretty cool. Oh, the other thing was, so after that first meeting, whether it was that night, I can't remember, we had to go to the post office where they had all these phone booths. And Koran got to call and talk to my mother. And he knew enough Western Armenian that they could communicate. So that was the first time they had spoke. So that was really a neat thing.
Was that the main first cousin that came and met you and quizzed him and stuff?
Yes. And I don't know, do you remember the conversation you had with him?
When I spoke with him, he said, "Oh, you sound just like my mother." Well, see, she grew up in Western, Turkey. And it's a Western Armenian that she spoke. And they had ended up in Beirut. And then from Beirut, when in 1947, they were inviting the Armenians to come to the homeland. And that's when the family decided to move there. And so it's my father's sister-in-law. She would be my aunt, her daughter, son-in-law, and 2 boys. And then Horen said he was born on the way in 1947 to Armenia.
That is pretty amazing. I hope you still are in touch with them once in a while. So if you go back, Sarah, you haven't been to Armenia, have you?
No, I have not.
I've asked her, but
Well, the habitat trips are kind of difficult because if you have any kind of a, back or leg problem and it becomes, affected over there, then
I love
what do you do?
America. I want to stay in America. I've been to Canada and Mexico, that's enough.
Right. So how has being Armenian affected your life? I mean, you feel you're Armenian, you feel it has had any influence on your life?
It's
You
my
feel different?
It's my background, but I don't feel any different than any other nationality about their parents, because many people like us, they're different nationalities, but they have the same stories, and that's how they end up in America. Like my husband, mom was kind of concerned, we speak Armenian, he might be offended, and Ray said, no. My grandparents came from Germany, and my family speaks German. He says, I know how that goes. He said, I don't understand it all, but he's like, you. But he said, no, I'm not offended. He had that understanding.
I feel fortunate to be, I'm half Armenian, but a lot of times I consider myself 100%. It's the food, the culture, the connection. I feel very fortunate that I am. I mean, the history, the survivability of the people. So I feel good about it.
Do people ask you, what are you, what nationality you are?
Yeah.
And you say I'm half Armenian or just
Sure.
Armenian?
Well, and growing up in Rochester, Minnesota, back in the 70s, it was very Caucasian, very few minorities, and being, especially in the summer, I would tan a little darker, and people thought I was Mexican. You know, when I played baseball, I started getting all these nicknames. Actually, to this day, I have friends that still call me Taco. So, yeah. But no, I mean, if we talk about Armenian, it's something I'll share with them. And, you know, a lot of people didn't have the schooling to learn about it, you know, so you can help educate them. But, you know, some people do, then it's good to know.
But you did not feel, you, Mark, did not feel rejected or did not have any issues just being Armenian, other than maybe you were a bit darker than the others?
Yeah, no. There was only one time, this was kind of strange, it was after 9/11, and I was at the airport. I was traveling by myself, and there was a big long line to go through security, and I got singled out, and I felt like maybe I had a little bit of a Middle Eastern look that I was a little skeptical.
Probably,
Yeah. But other than that, no. Oh, I should say, now that I remember, back in college, so when the whole Iranian thing was going on, so I was going to Rochester Community College at the time, and there was a bar near the school we had been at one night, and I remember going to the restroom, and I got cornered by 3 guys, and they thought I was Iranian. And they wanted to beat me up. And I told them, I said, I'm not. Luckily, they let me go, but that was another time.
They believed you? Did you say you were
Yeah,
Armenian?
I don't know, somehow I got them to believe that I wasn't, and I must have sounded American enough that,
Yeah, not your own.
yeah. So, yeah, I had very few instances though.
So are there any specific events, incidents, or conversations, or people that stand out in your life that have had any effect on you in terms of being Armenian?
I guess just growing up with our family and my godparents, going on once a year picnics and meeting other families. And then my father, when Saturday morning, he would make deliveries of fruits, vegetables, or chickens. And his customers were Italian, Polish, Jews. When the Jewish people ordered anything, the rabbi had to come out to the farm and bless the animal. So I got to meet some of the Armenians. They like to come up to the car and pinch your cheek. I don't really know why. To me, it hurt my cheek. I used to hide it, slide down and pretend I wasn't there.
Me too.
I still do it to my daughters. Oh, it hurts.
You know, I wouldn't say there's anyone in particular other than family, relatives. When I moved out east after college, I lived with my aunt and uncle, and my aunt, my mom's sister, was like a second mother to me, and so there's always been a strong connection with her especially. So I would say mainly relatives as far as Armenian influence.
Now, the Tashchians were your godparents, and you were in somebody's wedding. What was that story?
Oh, Joe Tashin was in our wedding, and he was like 5 years old. Harry was the oldest, then Lucy, Patty, Michael. Then it was my brother, little Harry, and me. There was the 6 of us. My sister was too little to join us. She was probably a couple years old. Anyway, they would come out to the farm, and sometimes my godfather would take us to the movies, all of us. And then he'd come back and our parents would play cards, and then they'd come and pick us up after the movies. And when Harry got his driver's license, Big Harry, his father gave him all the instructions, how to be careful, and all of us kids had to be quiet while he drove. And he did. He followed all the instructions and he drove. We went to the movies and then we came home. But we used to do a lot of fun stuff on the farm, running around, playing in the creek, catching little fish in a pail, and then releasing them. And we had a BB gun, and Harry was in charge of the making safe, set up a target and try to shoot, and making sure nobody got hurt. Patty, she was closer to me, and we used to have a lot of fun conversations. Patty was beautiful. Elizabeth Taylor looked like Patty. She was just beautiful.
I know that both Harry and Alice are gone now, but have you stayed close to the Tasjan family at all?
Well, I should mention, so Harry was with IBM and had moved to Rochester prior to us, correct?
Yeah,
They
they came out to the house and said goodbye, you were just a baby. And they moved out here, and we've stayed in touch.
Well, we were going
We went to the same church together in Rochester for many years, and actually Chris and I acolyted together through junior high and high school.
It's Joe's brother.
Yes, yep, Francine, Chris, Joe, and Eddie. And we were a year apart. Chris is a year older. So, I mean, our family saw each other in Rochester for several years after, leaving New York.
I'm staying in touch with Chris and his wife. And the last was Alice and Harry were cremated and they wanted to be in our church columbarium. And that's where they are, but they were planning to have a church service, but they haven't gotten all the family together so that we haven't had anything at our church yet.
They passed away quite a few years ago, both of them.
Harry passed away on July 26th of 2012, and Alice was in January of 2013. So it's been a while.
And the kids who are here, do you stay in touch with the kids? Mark, are you in touch with like Joe and
Francine.
Fran?
Actually, Francine works at United Health now, and we've been trying to arrange to get together for lunch. Chris's son, Rafi, also works there, so the three of us, we had planned to here a couple weeks ago, but Francine had an accident at home, and she doesn't work in the office that often, so we're trying to coordinate to get that. Eventually we're going to meet up. I've seen Chris at a few of the functions here and there, but it's really, and Joe has actually come, but I haven't kept in touch, with them too much.
Great. Anything else you two would like to add? Otherwise, maybe we'll see if anybody has questions for you.
I should tell you that all of our holidays growing up, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, Easter, we spent with the Tashims. They were, like Mom said, if anything happens to us, they're your parents. So we were together all the time, growing up together. My cousins who lived a town away, we didn't see them that often because they didn't have transportation. And we only got to see them when my dad drove over. But we all got together after everybody learned how to drive. We all got together.
So I have a couple of quick, interesting stories.
Sure,
Kind of Armenian connections and coincidences. About 3 years ago, Mom and I had taken a trip to Florida in the spring. Her cousins live in the Miami area, and we hadn't seen them. She hadn't seen them for a number of years. I had been down there, I don't know, a few years before, but so we went down for Easter and had some time with them, and then drove over to Fort Myers. We wanted to see a couple Twins games, and one of her friends was living in Fort Myers at the time, so we stayed with her. We ended up going to the Twins game, And about halfway through the game, it was a beautiful day. All of a sudden, a bunch of people started leaving. I thought, what? That's kind of strange. Well, maybe the regulars have left and now they're going. But all of a sudden, this storm blew in, and it was like a typhoon. Strong winds, pouring rain. So we scrambled to go under the shelter area. And just as we're getting there, there's a man approaching me. He goes, I know you. And I said, he says, you're Mark. And I said, yeah, Mark Risbet. He goes, I'm Ben Rip Nigerian. He had driven down with his wife and then picked up a pastor friend of theirs from Charlotte, North Carolina, to see the twins. And just by chance, we happened to run into each other because of that storm. And so we chatted for a while. They had planned to come to the next game, and we made arrangements that we could all sit together. And so we did, and the next game they're playing Toronto, and we're chatting away, and then there's this player from Toronto that came up to bat. And if I can remember his name, Wwilguai, I think it was. So we're saying, this is an Armenian player. Well, Ben's wife says, is he from Chicago? And we looked it up, Arlington Heights. She says, I know his family. And so that was kind of a cool connection. So you never know. On that same trip, we had visited the Pompeians that were down in Naples, so it was a really fun trip. I have another quick one. This is probably close to 20 years ago after I moved back. I was at a Gopher basketball game. And I had just gone by myself, got a great seat, and before the game I went out to the concession stand, and as I'm coming back, I'm holding my drinks. Well, the people, I was sitting near the end of the row, they had come in on the first two seats, and as I'm coming back, I recognize the person there, but he's blocking my entrance back into my seat. And I said, Inch Besses, and all of a sudden, he looks at me, it was Dr. Nigerian. So we became best buds after that. So that was a lot of fun. And then if you want to talk about the Nigerians you said outside of Binghamton, Grandpa, your connection with Steve Rip Nigerian.
Well, my father always traveled to nearby towns. I don't know if it was grain for the cattle or whatever it was. And I remember him saying he was in Greene, New York, and he said there's one Armenian family there, and we were surprised. You know, we didn't realize Armenians lived in these little towns. And I learned later, Steve Nigerian grew up in Greene, New York. And so Mark was asking me, do you know the Nigerians? I said, well, I know the one in Binghamton, but I said, I don't know the ones in Greene, New York, but I only know there was an Armenian family there. So that must have been the one my father was referring to.
You were talking about the medals.
Oh, you know, I learned from Janet that his family had the ribbon business, and they made those ribbons for like the service gives to officers. And I'm not sure if they're still in business or if the family retired. I haven't heard.
I think they're still in business.
They're still doing it
Because
because
they're
we
the
need.
only one in the whole country
Yeah,
that
it's the,
sells ribbons.
you're right. It's the only place where they cook the ribbons.
Very simple.
Okay, anybody has any questions for them, for Mark or Sarah?
So, growing up in New York, did you ever have any interaction with Armenians in Niagara Falls?
No, not Niagara Falls, but I remember we went to Canada, Hamilton, because one of the girls who lived in Syracuse, New York, married an Armenian fella from Hamilton, or St. Catharines.
St. Catharines.
And we went to visit her. So we drove through Niagara Falls, but I didn't meet any other Armenians. As far as I know, if she's still living, she's still a Canadian.
Did you want to tell the story about Uncle Marcus before? No. It's got Mom had been at an AYF, and I'm not sure which one it was,
It was I think it was the New York City one.
New York City, and she had met my now uncle prior to him marrying my aunt, and he had asked her at that time, because I think Mom was a couple years older than him, if she had a sister. And eventually he met my mom's sister, and they got married. But I thought that was kind of interesting. He met my mom first.
And then he was in the service, and when he got home from the service, my sister was at the Detroit AYF convention, and he was there because he was out of the
He's
service,
from Boston.
and that's where he met her. So,
Always these connections. Any other questions? Well, thank you both very much for coming and doing your presentation, answering questions and everything else. And we have time to just stand around, socialize, or sit around and socialize. Have some cookies and some soda that's hopefully being kept cool.
Great story.
So, thank you. Oh, well, I know we got more. Well, we have a picnic coming up, I believe it's August 25 or so. It's a Sunday around 3 p.m. It's over at the Gregorian's house because Laurel and Henry, they decided with the Ericksons to switch because they both have pools. The Ericksons pool and then Gregorians have a pool also, but there's a saltwater pool.
Oh, wow.
So
I've
be
never
prepared
been.
for that. So,
What day is that?
it's a Sunday, I think it's August 25 or 23, are you there, Karen?
We'll be sending out stuff.
25, yes,
Oh, okay.
August 25. So put that on your calendar and come, bring friends, family, whatever, it will be potluck, so
Where did they live?
Roseville.
Oh, all right.
I just wanted to tell you that
Oh,
Yeah, Sarah's got something else to share.
when you mentioned Mr. Gregorian,
Yeah, Henry?
years ago, when the kids were real little, of course, the four of us and my mom, we went to Massachusetts to visit my sister and family. Ray had gotten 4 tickets to the Boston Pops. And that's when we learned about he and his brother playing that night. It was very
Was
enjoyable.
Henry playing too? I know Ruben was in the.
There were 2 brothers.
So Henry was playing also at the time.
Henry and Henry's brother?
Yeah,
His
Ruben, I
brother,
think was.
the 2 of them.
Oh, Ruben.
Yeah.
I
Was it right?
don't remember the name.
Yeah, it was Ruben Gregorian.
So then I was surprised when we were at somewhere up here for an Armenian function. And we learned that he was here, and I was with Helen Pompian, and she, I think, was the one that told me.
Oh, wow.
That's how I heard of him. And I thought, oh, he must have moved here from Massachusetts.
Henry always used to talk about his brother. He talked about his brother often.
They both played in.
The whole family is musical. His daughter plays up in Superior. She plays the violin up in Superior for the orchestra, yeah.
Was Ruben also a violinist, or did he play something else?
I don't know what he played.
Conductor, composer.
Oh,
Wow. Is he still living?
I'm pretty sure it's Ruben there.
yeah, that's what I think too, Mark. And Henry, of course, doesn't, is not remembering much of anything now, but yeah.